In the course of my study of history over the years, I've made some observations. And some of these observations have congealed into what I call Brands' Laws of History. Now, I call them Brands' Laws of History not because I'm particularly proud of them and I want the world to know that I discovered them. No, in fact, it's kind of the opposite. I want the world to know, I want actually you to know, that they are simply my idiosyncratic takes on history. And they don't have the status of laws of government. They don't have the status of laws of physics. This isn't the second law of thermodynamics or anything like that. These are what I've observed. These are patterns of human behavior. In fact, I'll tell you that the first of Brands' laws says that there are no laws of history, but there are patterns. So that's what we're really talking about here, patterns. And today I'm going to talk about Brands' fourth law of history. Brands' fourth law of history states the following: sooner or later, countries get the foreign policies they can afford. Sooner or later, countries get the foreign policies they can afford. Now, this is about foreign policy, obviously, and it's also about economics. The essence of this law, of this pattern, is that rich countries have ambitious foreign policies. Poor countries have modest foreign policies. The poor countries of the world are forced to simply bend to the way the world is. Poor countries, like sort of poor people, have to accept the way the world is and make their best in it. Rich countries, sort of like rich people, can attempt at least to change the world. They can make the world suit their preferences. Now, that's the essence of the law. Rich countries have ambitious foreign policies. This does not say that rich countries always have successful foreign policies, but the rich countries do try to bend the world to their will. Okay, now there's an important part of this law, the opening clause, sooner or later. Because some countries respond to wealth rapidly and quickly develop ambitious foreign policies. But usually that's not the case. Usually there's a time lag. Usually countries take some while getting used to the fact that they have become rich and powerful. And so the sooner or later part is important. It's hard to tell. It's often impossible to tell ahead of time how long it's going to take a country to get adjusted to newfound wealth, for example. And I would add that it works on the downside as well, that sometimes countries that are powerful, that have been rich and powerful, are no longer so rich. They often continue to think, however, that they are powerful, and they often attempt ambitious foreign policies when they no longer have the economic strength to support them. Okay, so that's the law. I'm going to explain a little bit. I'm going to describe how it has played out in American history. Sooner or later, countries get the foreign policies they can afford. The essence of this is that rich countries have ambitious foreign policies. But what does it mean to be rich? Well, it means that you have, as a country, you have the resources to devote to foreign policy. Now, sometimes a country can be relatively small, but have a large, well, I'll use the term gross domestic product, GDP, and therefore can use that. Sometimes countries are very large, and they can have a large GDP, but they have to devote nearly all of it to the support of their people at home. So take this into account and look at it from the standpoint of the United States. So the United States began its national career as a weak, poor country. It was this agglomeration of 13 states, pretty independent states, clinging to the Atlantic coast of North America. These American colonies, now declared states, the United States of America, as I say, they weren't particularly united at first, they had their hands full simply achieving independence against Britain. And the United States would have had great difficulty achieving independence without the assistance of a great power, France. It was when France entered the Revolutionary War that the United States really had a chance of confirming its independence. And in the war against Britain, the French Navy and French troops were as important as American military forces in winning the victory for the United States. So the United States was a weak country. And after the war was over, the United States fell out with France, and then the United States had another war with Britain in 1812. And the war with Britain in 1812 did not go well. It ended in a tie, but only after British troops had raided Washington, had occupied the Capitol, had burned the Capitol, burned the White House and other government buildings. It was an embarrassing war, saved only at the last minute by Andrew Jackson's victory at the Battle of New Orleans. So during this period, fighting on its home soil, the United States could barely hold on against Britain. And for the rest of the 19th century, the United States remained a weak power. In the early 19th century, Thomas Jefferson sent American naval forces against the pirates of the Barbary states, of the North African states. These are really small potatoes in world affairs, and the United States had its hands full dealing with them. So in the world at large, the United States was not a major player in the 19th century. In the world smaller, in its own area, the United States showed growing strength. So the United States gradually expanded its western frontier until it crossed the entire North American continent, waged a war against Mexico in the 1840s. And the war turned out to be successful, but Mexico wasn't a pushover. And if Mexico had been more united politically, the United States would have had much greater difficulty. Okay, so bear in mind that during the 19th century, the United States does not have grand ambitions. Regional ambitions, North America, yes, but ambitions to tip the balance of power in Europe, for example, no. In fact, in 1823, James Monroe articulated the Monroe Doctrine that said, and the Monroe Doctrine is often remembered as telling Europe to stay out of American affairs. But in fact, it equally said that the United States would stay out of European affairs. At the time, independence-minded nationalists in Greece, for example, were pleading with the United States and other countries to come to their aid against the Ottoman Empire. But the United States said, no, we're not going to do it. So the United States would stay out of Europe's affairs. And this remained the American position through the 19th century. It was an age of, it wasn't exactly isolationism, and the term wouldn't be really developed until later. But in effect, that's what it was. The United States simply kept its distance from the affairs of Europe, kept the distance from the affairs of Asia. Again, it dealt with things going on in North America. And the reason for this was primarily that the United States did not have the wealth, did not have the economic heft to throw its weight around. Things changed, though, during and after the Civil War. The Civil War made Americans, especially Americans in the North and the West, on the Union side, it made them realize that this country is getting powerful. The Industrial Revolution was taking off. It was largely Northern industry that allowed Union forces to defeat Confederate forces. And the Industrial Revolution only accelerated after the Civil War. So in the 30 years from the end of the Civil War to the middle of the 1890s, American industrial power increased dramatically to the point where by 1900, we'll take the end of the 19th century, by 1900, the United States had the largest economy in the world. Now, how do we measure this? In fact, in those days, nobody quite knew how to measure it. The concept of gross domestic product didn't really exist. And even if it had, nobody knew quite how to measure it. But historians looking back can say that by 1900, the United States had greater industrial production than Britain, Germany, France, Russia, the major countries of Europe. The countries of Asia, the only ones that even approached that level were Japan was coming up, but it wasn't there yet, and China. China had been a big, powerful country, but it had sort of fallen into disrepair. So in 1900, in fact, starting in the 1890s sometimes, the United States surpassed Britain and Germany as having the most powerful economy, the richest, most powerful economy in the world. But the United States did not yet develop an ambitious foreign policy. Now, part of this is, again, the time lag. The time lag is institutional in part. So to project one's power, to project a country's power abroad, that country has to develop military forces, armies, yeah, that you can move to other countries, navies especially during this period, because this was the age of the beginnings of steam-powered navies. And if you wanted to project your power around the world, then you had to have a big navy. Britain had a big navy. Germany was developing a navy. The United States Navy was lagging far behind. Now, during the 1890s, some people in the United States, like Theodore Roosevelt, who would become Assistant Secretary of the Navy, thought that the United States needed to develop a big navy in order to project American power abroad. And they began doing so, but building up the Navy takes time. It's a long-term project. As of the early 1890s, the United States Navy was equal to the Navy of Chile or something like that. So if the United States had gotten in a big war in the early 1890s, the United States would have been smacked around. In fact, so this idea of projecting power is partly institutional. It's partly emotional, or in terms of sort of expectations. And this is related to institutions as well. So, in American history, the expectation of the American people was that the country would mostly be devoted to peace. Republics, the American republic, where people rule. The United States is not ruled by a king or by a dictator. When the people rule, the presumption was that the people wouldn't be warlike. So the people, American people, didn't want to spend a lot of time going to war, and they didn't want to spend a lot of money on war. It's one thing for a king to say to his subjects, all right, everybody, we're going to war. Now you pay taxes, and you other guys join the army, and off we go. But in a republic, when people make their own decisions, the thinking was that the United States would rarely go to war because people didn't want to pay the money for war. They didn't want to have to get drafted in the military or volunteer for the military. And so, therefore, America would be peaceable. And so the United States would not have a standing army. That is, an army that was there all the time, even during peacetime. And the United States, for the first century and a half of its existence, did not have a large standing army. The American model was, okay, when there's a war, the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the War with Mexico, the Civil War, citizens will be called into military service, typically in the form of militia. Militia, what we nowadays call the National Guard. And they're organized by state. And sometimes the militia would be integrated into a larger national army, as during the Civil War. But it was a voluntary thing, and the most important aspect of it, it was a temporary thing. So citizens, farmers, would put down their plows, pick up their gun, and go off to war. And they would fight as long as the war was on, and then when the war was over, they'd go home. And so the United States didn't have, American taxpayers, did not have the burden of paying soldiers during peacetime. What a waste. Same thing for a Navy. And in fact, for the Navy, it was perhaps even more striking, because the United States hardly had a Navy didn't have a Navy at the beginning of the Revolutionary War. It hardly had a Navy during peacetime in the 19th century. What the United States would do when the country went to war and needed the equivalent of a Navy is it would basically take private ships, and for the purpose of the period of the war, the time of the war, would draft the ships, as it were, into a Navy. They were called privateers. They would be given a license, and they could go conduct raids on enemy shipping. Now, this didn't work out entirely, and so eventually the United States actually did build a Navy. But the Navy was small relative to the size of the United States, and relative to the fact that the United States had a long Atlantic coast that needed defending, and eventually a Pacific coast that needed defending. So the United States was this two-ocean country. by the end of the 1840s after the war with Mexico when the U.S. acquired California. But the American Navy lagged far behind. Again, the problem was that a Navy was expensive and Americans didn't want to spend a lot of money on war. So it took quite a while for the idea that the United States might need an army, might need a navy. The Navy part, that lesson was absorbed sooner because you can always get an army going. You can call people into the service of the country and they can put down their plows, or by the 1880s and 1890s they can put down their tools if they work in factories, and they can go join the army. And in the early days, when most people were farmers and lived in the country, they already knew how to fire a rifle. You know, they would hunt squirrels or whatever, turkey or whatever they were going to hunt. They already knew how to use them. Once you get into the industrial era, city dwellers didn't know how to use rifles, but you can be trained in this stuff in relatively short order. So, for example, when the United States went to war against Spain in 1898, there was a call for volunteers, and the volunteers came and they were trained, and the training took 3 months or so. And then you knew enough to go off and fight. So this was the model. This was a model that persisted into the 20th century when the United States entered World War I. It didn't have a large standing army. In fact, even when the United States entered World War II, the United States didn't have a large army. It had to gear up. This is why, for example, as late as World War II, it took the United States more than a year to actually get deeply involved in the war. Now, that's the Army side of it. Things would change after World War II. After World War II, the United States did not demobilize its army in the same way it had demobilized its army after every previous wars. And from World War II, on account of the Cold War, which we'll get into, on account of the Cold War, the United States maintained this large military establishment during peacetime. With the Navy, it began a little bit earlier. And so Theodore Roosevelt and others launched this shipbuilding program in the 1890s. And so by the late 1890s, the United States had some ships of decent size. So by the 1890s, the United States is kind of growing into its capacity to do something. But Americans still, by and large, do not think of themselves as a great power. In fact, take someone like Theodore Roosevelt. Take Theodore Roosevelt, who was born in the late 1850s. He was born before the Civil War. He was born when the United States was a small country and didn't have ambitious foreign policy aspirations. Take his cousin, Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt was born in the early 1880s. So he grew up at a time when the United States still thought of Europe as this continent far away, of Asia as something that the United States need have very little to do with. And Franklin Roosevelt's a really good example of this because the United States, by the time Franklin Roosevelt graduated from college in the beginning of the 20th century, the United States was the wealthiest country on earth. It had the most powerful economy on earth. It could have had the most ambitious foreign policy on earth, but it did not. The American people, including Franklin Roosevelt, still thought of the United States as this small country, as this relatively weak country with modest foreign policy ambitions that it was when he was young. And these smaller and these modest notions carried forward well into the 20th century. So, but different people come to the conclusion that the United States should have a more ambitious foreign policy at a different pace. Theodore Roosevelt was one who was just sort of ambitious for his country, ambitious for himself. So he began beating the drums, as it were, for a more ambitious foreign policy. Theodore Roosevelt was one of a group that should be called, they didn't really call themselves imperialists, but they should have been called imperialists because they advocated an empire, a large imperial, I didn't use the term imperial, a large role for the United States in foreign policy. And Theodore Roosevelt became Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he sketched out a plan for the use of this Navy in a very ambitious, indeed aggressive way. After the war with Spain, when the United States was in a position where it could acquire a formal empire in its treaty with Spain, annex the Philippines, annex Puerto Rico, Roosevelt was all in favor of this. He said, you know, the United States needs to have a foreign policy to match its wealth. On the sooner or later spectrum, Roosevelt was one of the sooner who said the United States should have a foreign policy to match its wealth. And he and the other imperialists persuaded William McKinley, the president, and the Senate that ratified the treaty, that the United States, yes, indeed, should have this empire, should have a foreign policy as ambitious as the American economy was wealthy. They saw that the United States could afford this, and they said, we ought to have it. But they didn't convince most Americans. And although the treaty with Spain, giving the United States control of the Philippines and Puerto Rico, putting the United States on the world stage as an imperial power with ambitions equal to those of Britain and France and Germany, the great powers of the world, even though they got that treaty through, most Americans really weren't buying it. In the aftermath of the war against Spain, they were willing to go along with it, but very shortly they said, you know, we don't really want to pay for this empire. And so they shortchanged governing of the Philippines, and they didn't continue to build up the Navy that people like Theodore Roosevelt wanted. And they said, you know, we're still at heart those farmers back from the old days when we don't want to mess with the world. If the world doesn't mess with us, we don't want to mess with the world. And Americans took this attitude, Americans at large, took this attitude of Europe's problems, for example, are Europe's problems, they're not our problems, into the decade of World War I. And when World War I broke out, most Americans said, boy, we don't want to have anything to do with this. Now, if Americans had been thinking along the lines of what their national wealth would allow, they could very well have said at that point, you know what, here's our chance. We can make our mark on the world. We can impose our values on the world. We can bring the world around to our way of thinking. But most Americans, including Woodrow Wilson, the president, said, no, that's not what we want. And so Wilson declares neutrality for the United States, and Americans are willing to go along with it. It didn't work out. And one of the things that Americans discovered in World War I, we'll see more about this later, what Americans discovered in World War I was they might want to leave the world alone, but the world didn't want to leave America alone. Because if you are a great power, if you're a Britain or a France or a Germany, and there is this other potential great power out there, you have to figure out how to deal with that, either potentially or actually. Another thing was, Americans wanted some of the perks of engagement with the world without the responsibility of engagement with the world. So Americans insisted on being able to trade with other countries, even when those other countries were at war, and even when those other countries were trying to stop trade from third parties with their enemies. This had been an issue in American foreign policy since the 1790s. It had been an issue through the 19th century. It was an issue into the 20th century. And it was perhaps the most important issue that got the United States involved in World War I. Now, one of the things that Americans discovered in World War I was, you know what? We're powerful enough. We can actually be the deciders. We can be the balance tippers in Europe. And when American troops entered World War I, they tipped the balance in the favor of the side that had Britain and France, of the Allied powers. So Americans discovered from this, you know what? We actually are a great power after all. We didn't particularly want to be, but here we are. We're the ones who determine who wins this war. And yet, Americans were still thinking, but that's not what we want to do on a full-time basis. You know, we'll do it in a crisis. We'll send our troops, the doughboys as they were called in World War I, we'll send them to Europe briefly. And Americans fought in the war just for less than 2 years. And they made they had the decisive influence. But then at the end of the war, Woodrow Wilson, America's president, had been convinced by the American experience during the war that the United States needed to remain involved in world affairs. That American wealth would sustain an American commitment to international affairs, and that the United States needed to do it for its own self-defense. But most Americans did not. And when the Senate rejected the treaty that ended the war, the Treaty of Versailles, that would have included American membership, indeed leadership, in an international body called the League of Nations, most Americans said, yeah, that's right. We don't want to get involved any more than absolutely necessary in world affairs. So the United States, in fact, retreated from world affairs during the 1920s and 1930s. This was a period of deliberate isolationism. Americans had tested the waters of engagement in international affairs, and most said, no, we don't want to do that, because the outcome of the war, of the First World War, didn't seem very satisfactory, and it looked like Europe was going to go to war again. And most Americans said, no, 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 keep Europe at a distance. James Monroe was right. Leave Europe for the Europeans to mess around with. And this was the thinking. This was sort of this small, modest foreign policy thinking persisted and guided American policy through the 1930s. And it didn't really end until Pearl Harbor, when Japanese forces attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii in December 1941. And then Americans realized finally, you know, when you are the greatest economic power on earth, other countries are going to be messing with you even if you don't want to mess with them. The Japanese attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor for fear of what the United States could do to Japan's ambitions in East Asia. And at that point, it was like a wake-up call. And Americans realized, pretty much all of them all at once, you know what? We are a great power whether we like it or not. And it was America's great power, in particular, America's economic power, that led the Allied powers to victory in World War II. The United States became the arsenal of the anti-fascist forces. And American factories churned out the tanks and the planes and the trucks and everything else needed to defeat Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy and militaristic Japan. And the United States, during this period from 1941 to 1945, during the period of World War II, Americans woke up finally to the fact that, you know what? Sooner or later, countries do get the foreign policies they can afford. And we can afford the most ambitious foreign policy ever. In 1945, the United States was the wealthiest country in the history of the world. America's gross domestic product, America's industrial GDP, equaled that of the rest of the world combined. The United States was more powerful compared to the rest of the world than any country in history ever had been. And it's at that point that the United States adopts a very ambitious foreign policy that persisted through the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century. Now, here we are, we're a fifth of the way into the 21st century, and a question arises, and you said sooner or later countries get the foreign policy they can afford. Well, this works on the upside, it works on the downside as well. Countries that used to be powerful are no longer so powerful. Britain was the great power of the world during the 19th century, but Britain's economy stumbled in the 20th century, so that Britain could no longer afford such an ambitious foreign policy. Will the United States follow the same path? There's an upward curve, and we've been on the upward curve. Have we topped out? Are we going to dip down? Well, this is something that remains to be seen. And it will give a test to Branz's fourth law. Sooner or later, countries get the foreign policy they can afford. The United States still has a pretty ambitious foreign policy. Can the United States afford to sustain it? That is a question for the future.